Welcome back. One of the first lessons we learn in basic economics is that pricing is inherently linked to demand. However, unfortunately, modelling this link is incredibly difficult due to the number of variables that can get in the way. Today on LokadTV, we're going to learn how the advances in machine learning and big data now have changed all this and mean it is now possible for pricing optimization for modern companies. So Johannes, perhaps you could tell us a little bit about how the classical approaches that many companies are taking to pricing today.
I mean, the most spectacular thing about pricing is typically how, I would say, disconnected it is from demand planning in general. You know, you have, let's say, the marketing team that is going to assess what is the good price point for the products. And then I would say in largely isolation, completely or frequently completely isolated, you will have the planning teams that will decide what will be the demand, and maybe the sales team will coordinate all of that as part of an S&OP process. But I would say numerically, the pricing is mostly ignored once somebody has made up his mind on the price point of a given product.
Okay, so we already covered kind of those S&OP processes in a previous episode. The pricing itself, how well does that work as a mechanism?
So, I mean, it's economics 101 is that typically as you increase the price, you decrease the demand. I mean, in theory, there is a class of goods known as variable goods where it can be the opposite because a higher price tag makes them more appealing. But our experience at Lokad is that those goods are exceedingly rare. So for pretty much anything that is like normal stuff, if you increase the price, you decrease the demand. And this is relatively, I would say, obvious. And yet it gets very tricky because when you think in terms of classic supply chain optimization, you focus a lot on the demand, but pricing is inexistent. I mean, most, I would say, supply chain planning tools do not even take into account pricing. So you're completely blind, and obviously it means that whenever there is a strong pricing effect that comes into play, well, all the planning and all your forecasts are just dramatically off.
So it's one of the reasons a lot of these sort of supply chain tools don't take into account pricing is because there's so many variables. There's things like marketing, influences, there's things that can get in the way of demand. So is that the reason why pricing isn't really taken into account?
I mean, yes, but also just because the amount of variables in itself is not necessarily such a problem. I mean, with the processing power of modern computers, you can deal with hundreds of thousands of variables. This is not in itself a showstopper. Yet, those, I would say, classical models tend to be completely simplistic. I mean, you think of the demand as a pure moving average with just a seasonal coefficient, and this is it. You're not even taking frequently into account things as basic as stockouts. So obviously, if you have stockouts, you observe zero sales, but that doesn't mean that you have zero demand. So let alone, pricing effect. And indeed, pricing is more subtle. And ideally, you would take into account the price of your competitors, which nowadays with web crawlers can be monitored online as well. So it has never been easier to actually get access to the data. There is even companies that are specialized in retrieving those prices for you.
Okay, so if it's not such a problem, if it is possible to keep track of all these variables, how can we begin to sort of work towards pricing optimization then? Where do you sort of start off?
I mean, the starting point is to acknowledge that your supply chain optimization needs to factor in the pricing optimization. You cannot dissociate the two, you see, because the traditional perspective is that you will have people that in isolation decide a price, and then other people in isolation that decide what will be the future demand. But the reality is that those two elements are completely coupled with one another. And if you cannot de-entangle them, they are fundamentally entangled. So that means that the starting point is to acknowledge process-wise that those things will go hand in hand. And if you by design separate them, then it doesn't matter how smart your machine learning stuff can be, all your numerical recipes, once they are completely made, separated by design, then you cannot acknowledge anymore from, I would say, a demand forecasting perspective, the fact that the pricing exists, because you're just blind, I mean, numerically speaking.
Okay, so the idea is that pricing is, instead of being something that you actually forecast, is something that you actually engineer yourself. So maybe an example here would be pretty good. Are there any companies here that are actually doing this well today?
Absolutely. Classical, I mean, e-commerce that are, as usual, I think ahead of the pack when it comes to very smart quantitative optimization, are aggressively, quantitatively optimizing their price. So basically, if they know they are heading for stockouts, there is no point in rushing to liquidate the stock that remains, because anyway, you will end up with a stockout. So you can inflate your price a bit, and you will still face your stock out, but at least you will have made a bigger margins on those last few units. Conversely, if you see that your competitors are all suffering from stockouts, there is no point in rushing to the point where you will face yourself a stockout just because of the extra influx of demand. Conversely, that's what old-fashioned retailers do. If you end up with too much stock for a given product at the end of the collection, well, you do a sales to basically liquidate what remains. So those dynamic pricing are already, I would say, used in production. And Amazon, if you look at the price displayed by Amazon, it's very much in flux. I mean, it changes from day to day, from hour to hour, even in very busy periods like pre-Christmas.
And so kind of the basis for that dynamic pricing, is it basically how products have performed historically and sort of the demand levels at those different points?
I mean, the idea is that pricing is many things. I mean, pricing is one message that you send to the market. So that this part is relatively rigid. You don't want to steer too much away from the message. I mean, if you position yourself as being, a cheap brand, you do not want, because of stockouts, to vastly increase your price. So there is this messaging part. That's for sure. That's important. That's I would say the long-term component. But also there is the fact that the pricing is a fantastic mechanism to basically accelerate or slow down demand, to help you cope with your supply chain challenges and your supply chain difficulties. The future is uncertain. It's very, very hard to have like an accurate forecast when basically the markets are extremely erratic. So having like a dynamic pricing is a way to make a better resource allocation and even to deliver a better service for your clients. There is no point, again, if you have two products that are almost perfect substitutes, but one of them is going to run out. It's almost a perfect substitute, but it's not necessarily a perfect substitute in the eyes of all your clients. Well, if you raise a bit the price of one of those two products, the clients who do not mind about choosing one product over the other will just fall to the other one, while the one who care will actually still have access to the product they really seek, and they are even willing to pay a little premium for that.
Okay, now let's sort of look at things from kind of the perspective of forecasting. I mean, how can you possibly build a forecast that works well in tandem with pricing?
I mean, the idea is that you have to give up on the idea of having, your static forecast. That's also one of my big concern with the classical perspective on forecasting, is that you're supposed to say, this is it. This is the future. We will sell 1,000 units of this thing. And the answer is, well, it depends, because your pricing is fundamentally a lever that can influence the demand. So what you're trying to forecast is fundamentally driven by something that you can do. So it's not about capturing future uncertainty, it's also capturing future decisions that you will make yourself. And those decisions, those future decisions, they are not uncertain. they are undecided. So you see, there is no uncertainty about your pricing. Your pricing is exactly what you want your pricing to be. If you want to raise your price, you can raise your price and except if you're in a highly regulated domain, let's say, mostly you have like complete freedom over your pricing. So there is no uncertainty, but you might change your mind. And so if you think of a static forecast, it's as if you were saying, well, my price will not change no matter what, which is bad. It's as if, you know, you were saying that no matter how incorrect my initial forecast was, I will not change my mind. You know, it's much smarter, and in business it means more profitable to be able to adjust a bit, you know, what you're doing depending on the feedback of the market.
Okay, so your idea here is that basically if you want to reduce demand because you're basically running out of stock, you'll increase the prices, and then if you want to increase demand, you can reduce the prices a little bit. So is this where a kind of a probabilistic approach kind of fits in? Is this where you're sort of having this range of possibilities might work well?
Yes, it's certainly probabilities really help, because it's, again, unless you're selling, you want to think of pricing effects for, let's say, the Big Mac sold in a large country like Germany, where you have like fantastic quantities. If you increase the price of the Big Mac, every single cent will probably have a measurable impact on the demand. So here you have a product that is sold at scale and highly price sensitive. So people should be able to measure the exact elasticity. I'm pretty sure that there is smart people at McDonald's who know exactly the price elasticity of the Big Mac, you know, country by country. But that works well because they have like huge amount of data. In typical supply chain situations, you know, you're not selling millions of units a week of a given product. Frequently, I mean, you end up with just a few hundred units a week, or even less than that. So it means that your pricing analysis is going to be very, very fuzzy. So where it does help is that having probabilistic forecasts mean that you can actually have forecasts where you just shift, you know, your demand forecast up or down, but it's still relatively uncertain. And the further away you are from your usual price point, the more extra uncertainty you will add. You see, because there is another angle, which is if you just move your price a little bit, well, it turns out that most probably your historical data is relevant as a baseline to guess what will happen. But if you were to think of what would happen if my price were, for example, 10 times cheaper, chances are that you have zero historical data to support that, just because you never did it. So you see, because it was not profitable, none of your competitors were able to do it either. So you just don't know. Nobody knows. You know, maybe there will be like 100 times more demand for your products if it was 10 times cheaper, but it's just not a point that you have ever explored, so you just don't know. And that's an extreme situation, but basically the same idea apply. The further away you are from your usual pricing practices, the less information you have coming from your history, so the more uncertainty you have.
Okay, so in the example of kind of the Big Mac, what you're saying is if you're changing by a couple of cents here or there, you'll have more of an understanding, whereas if you're changing by a couple of euros and a larger change, then you'll have much less of an understanding of the possible future. Let's talk about some of the technical requirements for pricing optimization. I mean, what does a company need? You said that sort of a Big Mac and McDonald's will have lots of historical data. What are kind of the technical requirements that a company needs in order to optimize their prices?
So your requirement to get started is first to bring together, you know, the teams that are engineering the price and the teams that are typically doing the planning and the one that are doing all the purchasing and the production plans. So you see, because the point is that you need to, as a requirement, you need to bring all those functions together, otherwise you will not be able to perform the optimization. It's like by design, you prevented yourself from even being able to execute that. Then you will, that's, I would say, the process requirements. Then in terms of data, you don't need that much actually. Your traditional historical sales data is good. You need to have, the usual suspects, your history of promotions that help, because promotions are like temporary price movements that are kind of interesting to decide to analyze what happens when you move the price. You need to have the historical stockouts as well to avoid to have like pollutions and outliers that you cannot explain price-wise. Ideally, if you can have the price of your competitors, at least on the web, that really helps. That's not strictly required, but that really helps to understand a bit. I would say the non-linearity effects when you get lower than the competitor or the competitor gets lower than you, that can have non-linear effects on the demand that you can see. You can see spikes and drops that are just explained because people shift from whoever is the least expensive.
And by bringing all these departments together, how does this kind of differ from a more traditional kind of S&OP approach?
I mean, that differs from the fact that fundamentally your pricing, you give up the idea on having a price per, let's say, product. You don't have a price, you have a pricing strategy. So you see, if let's say you're sourcing products in Asia and it's going to take 13 weeks between the time you're passing an order to your Asian supplier to the point of time where you can actually put the product on display and start selling in North America or in Europe. Why would you at day zero decide what your price will be when you will start to sell your product? 13 weeks later, this decision can be delayed. If 13 weeks later you see that demand has surge for this type of products, and that your initial order that was of 1,000 units, you already realize that it's going to be way too few. There is no point in sticking to what you had in mind at this time that was 13 weeks ago. You can, reassess based on the latest data that you have and decide something that is smarter.
You mentioned there sort of competitors' pricing and keeping track of their products. How much of a driver is that? How important is it to match sort of a competitor's pricing? Because particularly with the internet, we have very easy, free access to what different competitors are pricing at now. So how much of a driver is that?
I mean, it really depends from the verticals. It's, for example, if you are, let's say, a luxury brand, it doesn't really matter. It's not. Vuitton does not decide to lower the price because Cartier did. They are both are like premier luxury brands. That's part of their. They want to have best quality for their product, the best you can get anyway, and they are going to price accordingly. And all they're trying to achieve is the fact that normally, a luxury brand is supposed to be something that do not have a substitute. A Vuitton bag is not supposed to be like a perfect substitute for a bag produced by, let's say, Longchamp. At the other end of the spectrum, you have products that are like nearly perfect substitute. I mean, if you're buying, sugar by the kilogram, and you're just, let's say, a collective restaurant, it doesn't really matter who is your supplier for this, let's say, powder white sugars that you buy by the kilogram, as long as it meets all the, the standards, the quality standard that you seek, which are fairly well defined in the case of a product as simple as, let's say, white powder sugar.
Okay, if we sort of look ahead to the future, can you envisage a time when companies are setting pricing points, having a really solid understanding of what their resulting profits will be from that?
I mean, some companies, Amazon, as usual, are already doing it. We have a couple of clients that are, I would say, very aggressive e-commerce who are already doing it, even if they don't necessarily advertise it as much. And yes, I mean, again, if we look at more sophisticated verticals, like, for example, aerospace, is also already doing it. I mean, airlines are doing yield management, have been doing yield managements to sell, tickets, aircraft tickets for decades. But even when it comes to aircraft parts, they are also doing yield management already. So I would say sophisticated actors, e-commerce, aerospace, they are already doing it. And what I see is that it's coming to pretty much all the other verticals. It may be more or less applicable.
So to sort of conclude now, what is the key lesson we should be taking from today about pricing optimization?
I mean, pricing optimization is an integral part of demand and demand forecasts. There is no demand without a price. The price defines the demand and vice versa. So if your supply chain organization is trying to optimize while ignoring all the pricing effects, I mean, you are missing an elephant in the room. So, it doesn't matter if you micro-optimize your moving average. There is still this elephant that is still in the room and that you're still ignoring. That's bad.
Okay, well, hopefully nobody's missing the elephant in the room anymore. So that's everything for this week. Thanks very much for tuning in, and we'll see you again next time. Bye for now.